You wanted the best. You've got the best podcast, the hottest podcast in the world. The Chris Voss Show, the preeminent podcast with guests so smart you may experience serious brain bleed. The CEOs, authors, thought leaders, visionaries, and motivators. Get ready. Strap yourself in. Keep your hands, arms, and legs inside the vehicle at all times, because you're about to go on a monster education roller coaster with your brain. Now, here's your host, Chris Voss.
Hi, folks. This is Voss here from the ChrisVossShow.com. The Chris Voss Show. Welcome to another show, my friends. It's certainly wonderful to have you. Chris Voss Show, the family that loves you but doesn't judge you. Well, not harshly. Like your mom does. So clean your room. Anyway, guys, we have an amazing author on the show. He's the author of multiple books. Gautam Mukunda is going to be on the show with us today, talking about his book, Picking Presidents. But in the meantime, before we get to him, make sure you go do all the things. You must always do all the things. If you watched any YouTube video out there or any broadcast now, they do the begging part. This is what we call this segment. Please go to youtube.com, refer the show to your family, friends, and relatives. Go to goodreads.com/Chris Voss. See the big LinkedIn group, LinkedIn newsletter, and we're doing LinkedIn audio chats over there. We've got access to that. So we're kind of over there promoting stuff, talking about the Facebook or talking about the podcast and the Facebook, and talking about some of our guests that we have on, kind of giving you a backdrop to some of the stories and things that we had and fun parts of the show. Anyway, guys, be sure to check all that out. We certainly appreciate it, and refer the show to your family, friends, and relatives. Today, we have an amazing author on the show. He's written a prolific book. It's the hardcover is coming out October 18th, 2022. The Kindle is out now, which is pretty cool. You can get access to the Kindle if you want to take and get it. The name of the book is Picking Presidents: How to Make the Most Consequential Decision in the World. We have today Gautam Mukunda on the show. He's going to be talking to us about his amazing book. But first, let me tell you who he is and how he got here. He started his life, it sounds like one of those, what's that one show? I don't know. The show of This Is Your Life. He is an internationally recognized expert in leadership and innovation. He often jokes that his life ambition is to have the world's most confusing resume. We'll ask him about that when he's on the show, and that he's most of the way there. He is a research fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Center for Public Leadership. He is also the host of NASDAQ podcast World Reimagined and a columnist in NASDAQ's World Reimagined. Previously, he was a professor at Harvard Business School and a distinguished visiting professor for the Schwarzman Scholarship. He is the author of two books, Indispensable: When Leaders Really Matter, and this new one, Picking Presidents. He's published articles in Harvard Business Review. We love those and have their authors on. Foreign Policy, Security Studies, Slate, Fast Company, Parameters, Politics and Life Sciences, and Systems and Synthetic Biology on Leadership, Reforming the Financial Sector, Military Innovation, Network-Centric Warfare and Security, and Economic Implications of Synthetic Biology. Welcome to the show. We're glad to have you.
Oh, it's great to be here with you, Chris.
I think I ran out of commas on that last one. I was just going. You have a lot of stuff on your resume. Congratulations, my friend. Welcome to the show.
Oh, it's great to be here. This is going to be a blast.
There you go. And what is your .coms? Where can people find you on the interwebs?
It's GautamMukunda.com. I won't say it's spelled the way it sounds because it isn't.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're watching this or listening, GAUTAMMUKUNDA.com. And on Twitter, I'm at GMukunda, at GMUKUNDA.
There you go. So your previous book was on leadership. What made you want to write this book?
Well, funny story. I was actually getting started on a book on leadership in a crisis when candidate Donald Trump started running for the nomination, for the Republican nomination. And so way back in my first book, I had said that, look, when we study leaders, one of the most surprising things that the academic literature on leadership, right? Like, all the professors who study leadership, is they say most leaders actually don't matter that much. And you're like, what? I mean, I come from the, I come from the business world before I did my PhD, and I worked with the military. It's like, wait, leaders matter all. Like, I really, really care who's in charge. And if you ask anyone who's not an academic, they would say leaders are really, really important. But the people who say leaders don't matter, they're not dumb, right? Like they actually have 3 really good reasons for saying that, and they all make sense. And so the first one is the idea that leaders are externally constrained, right? You run a company, you can't set your prices at whatever you want because you can, if you set them too high, you get undercut. So it's a limit on what you can do. And then leaders are internally constrained, right? They have like culture and processes and budgets. And so that sets limits on what they can do. But the most important thing that stops leaders from having an impact is that for big organizations, right? So the powerful ones, the ones that have a big impact on the world, the leaders aren't chosen randomly. There's a process that they have to go through to get the top job. And that process evaluates the candidates for leadership. And it says, well, is this person what we're looking for? Is this person actually going to do what we want for the next few years? And if the answer is no, then they don't give them the job. They give it to someone else who will. And so the idea in all this research was that it's not the person who matters, it's the process.
Who wrote that? Let's go find them.
There's no one. Yeah, there's no one person, right? And the funny thing is, I'd say that was a pretty common view. Is if you're talking about like GE or McKinsey or Goldman Sachs or something like that, that's probably true, right? I mean, I've talked to plenty of CEOs who've said to me, well, like I think I do a great job, but I think there were plenty of other people at my company who, if they'd hired them, I'm not sure how different the outcome would have been. And so what I said was, the interesting thing about that is it's true except when it isn't. And it's the when it isn't that's really interesting, because if your process for selecting a leader, for whatever reason, doesn't have the chance to evaluate a candidate properly, right? Maybe that person inherits the job, or maybe they're an outsider and you don't really know that much about them, or maybe the corporate jet crashes with all the other candidates. Like you can imagine all sorts of stuff, right? In that situation, that person you pick to be the leader could be very, very different from all the other people who could have the job, right? And because they're very, very different, they could do things that were really, really different. They could make choices that were really, really different. And what do we know? As I said, I came from the business world. What do we know about choices, especially from finance, choices that you'd say one thing and everyone else in the world will do the other? What we know is the outcomes of those choices are really high variance. Right? You're either really, really, you look like a genius or you look like an idiot, but they're usually not boring. They're not in the middle.
Yeah.
So what I said is these kinds of leaders, who I call unfiltered leaders, the leaders who haven't been fully evaluated, they tend to be really high variance. They're either great or they're awful, but they're not boring. So my first book was about, laying out that set of ideas and creating a theory and, sort of testing them in a bunch of different areas, in politics and in business and in sciences and in military and things like that. And so, like in and of itself, this candidates who are sort of come in from the outside, who you don't know a lot about them, who maybe the organization's elites don't even like them and don't want them to get the top job, but they can't stop them for whatever reason. Well, that sounds a lot like Donald Trump, right? In 2016, you're like, yeah, that sounds pretty familiar. But where it got really a little weird, a little uncomfortable sometimes was, at the end of the first book, I said, well, look, if my prediction for these unfiltered leaders is they're going to be really great or really awful, but I don't know, but which one is kind of hard to tell. What would help me predict which one it's going to be, if it's going to be great or awful? And so the most important answer, and this is kind of my secret that I tell people, what the most important thing you can do when you're picking people? You need to be lucky. Right? Like luck. Luck really matters. Luck's incredibly important. Hyman Rickover, the American admiral who sort of invented the nuclear navy, he used to say that luck is better than skill. Or he's like, I can't use you if you're not lucky. But okay, like luck is important. But if setting that aside, if you can't, I can't guarantee you luck. I wish I could. What else? And I said so I can't tell you what's certain to make someone succeed. But I can identify characteristics that make someone look really likely to fail. Right? Because those characteristics, what they all have in common is they are a set of characteristics, traits, right? That make you look more impressive on first encounter than they are when you really get to know someone. Yeah. So they create like a really positive first impression, but in the long run, you realize this person's a disaster.
Yeah.
And we can all think of people like that, right? We've all met people like that in our lives, and we usually wish we hadn't.
Yeah.
And so I came up with 4 characteristics in that first book that I thought these are like big, what I said, they're warning signs, right? If someone has any one of these 4, you should say, it's just not worth the risk. It's not worth the risk of giving, because you don't know what they're going to do.
Yeah.
And if you make someone the leader, you give them power, And giving someone power is risky, right? Because then they got power. They can use it in ways you might not want. They can even use it against you sometimes.
Yeah.
So you don't want to take the risk if you have any of these 4 traits. So the 4 things that I came up with in the first book, which again was published in 2012, 10 years ago, not thinking anything about modern politics. And the 4 were personality and psychological disorders, where the examples I used were narcissism and psychopathy, highly simplistic or out of the mainstream ideologies, and an extremely risk-prone or incompetent managerial approach, and unearned advantages like inherited wealth.
Yeah. You came up with this in 2012?
2012, yeah. So that happened.
What was the third one again? I'm typing these out for my notes.
So psychological personality disorders, like narcissism, psychopathy.
How could I forget that?
Yeah. Like out of the mainstream or highly simplistic ideologies, a incompetent or extremely risk-prone managerial approach. Yeah. And unearned advantages like inherited wealth. Right. And all of those have in common is they make you look great on a sort of first encounter, but there's nothing there underneath the surface. Right. Or if there is something there, it's bad.
Yeah.
So so that happened. And
so you predicted all 4 of these things. If people had them, they probably wouldn't.
They probably won't go well for you. Yeah. If you make them in charge. So
if you make them in charge. Okay.
Yeah. If you put them in charge. Yeah. So, so the election happens, and one of my friends posted on my Facebook page. He says, "So did you have a time machine?" I'm like, "No, I did not. But I'd probably let's take another cut at these ideas and see what we can get." So what the second book is about is 2 things, right? One is I wanted to take those ideas and my ideas and synthesize them with all the people from, research from management and political science and economics and psychology, everything we knew about leadership, and say, is there a way to create an objective framework that anybody can use to evaluate presidential candidates to tell us, well, okay, even if this person's not my party, even if I wouldn't vote for them, I kind of feel confident that they could do the job. Right? Because even if the president isn't someone I personally want, the presidency is so powerful and so important, not just to us as Americans, but to the entire world, that you really want to make sure they can at least get the basics right? You just don't want to risk someone who doesn't know what they're doing there. So that's the first question, and that was the first objective of the book, is you should be able to take information that you can find in the New York Times or in Wikipedia, right? No deep biographical stuff. No need to look at their tax returns. Just what any informed citizen could know, and apply this model and see what you get.
There you go. And did you take into account that sometimes it's not the leaders that are the problem when they're evaluating or picking them? It's that the people that are picking them are idiots.
Yeah, so absolutely. And I mean, my whole thing, right, is about the process for picking people. That's how I got out of this thing.
Because there's a lot of great leaders, like when GE is evaluating people or a company's evaluating leaders, there are different great leaders they can pick, but there are different styles of leadership.
Yeah.
Maybe there's different segments or experience levels, like maybe someone who's a technology AT&T person, maybe they won't be good for GE's washing machine division. I'm just making up spitball stuff.
No, in fact, you're exactly right about that.
So they're still great leaders.
Yeah. So what I would say is there are 2 things about it. One is that picking leaders is not a ranking problem. It's a matching problem.
Matching.
Right. So you're not trying to rank people from 1 to 1,000 and say, this is the best leader and this is the worst leader. That doesn't make any sense. It's exactly what you just said. You want to figure out, okay, how do I fit? Is this person a right fit for my situation? That's the only way you're ever going to get it right. I was say it's like dating, right? Like teenagers want to date a supermodel. If you want a happy marriage, you date the person who's right for you, who's the right fit for you, right?
What?
One of my friends says that everybody has baggage. You just want to get someone with a matching set. And I'm like, yeah, okay, that's a great way to put it.
I like that analogy. Yeah. Note to self: find someone who's got as much baggage as I do. Wait, is that possible?
So absolutely. And in fact, by the way, your specific case is exactly right. GE used to be like the home ground of CEOs, right? Where every company in America that they would hire. So in fact, very specifically, 2 of my colleagues, Nithin Noria, who used to be the dean of Harvard Business School, and Boris Groysberg, wrote a paper where they showed that ex-GE CEOs if they went to companies that were similar to the division of GE they used to run, did well. And if they went to companies that were different from the division of the GE that they used to run, did poorly.
Really?
Yeah.
That's really interesting. I'd love to dig into some of that data. I love the aspect of leadership. You know, a good example was when I was young, I worked at a company that was eventually owned by Southern Bell. It was a big telemarketing firm. And there was one of the managers there who was the rotating head of the facility because they had shifts. She was really awful. She ran kind of like a high school division sort of management style where everyone just begged up to her. It was almost like a mini Trump, and sycophants, and no one got any work done because there was no reward for working hard. It was working for kissing her butt. Well, one day she was so toxic that she called in a bomb threat to the front desk as a joke to impress her little sycophants at the thing one day.
Well,
and I was sitting there while she did it. She came with the idea and decided to call the front desk security, and this is a facility of 1,000 people, and she's calling a bomb threat as a joke. She thought it was funny, and she was narcissistically, thought this would be humor. Of course, the front desk security knew the sound of her voice and where the call was coming from, and she was traipsed off by the police. 3 to 4 months later, they couldn't find good management, and they had good management, and they rehired her back.
Oh, good Lord.
Yes. Yeah. So there's an extreme example for you of how idiots can be the ones, the decision maker, and has nothing to do with the leader.
My goodness, yes. So this reminds me of so Al Dunlap, the sort of infamous former CEO of Sunbeam, right? Who took them from a multi-billion-dollar company to zero in about 18 months. And so his preferred managerial style, and this was not exceptional. This is just how Al Dunlap operated. Was he when he took over at Sunbeam, he called in one of his division heads. And as soon as the guy walks into his office, he set this up so it's in front of his subordinates, right? In front of the guy walks into his office, he starts screaming at him and swearing at him, doesn't let him get a word in edgewise, actually picks up a chair and throws it at him.
Wow.
And then ejects him from his office. And I always tell my students, if you see something like this happen at your company, find a new job. All right.
I'm trying to think if I've done that before.
Yeah. So there are, but the one thing I'll say is big institutions, when you you talk to the people at the top, right? They might be wrong.
Mm-hmm.
They often have incentives that are screwed up, and so they make bad decisions because they're fulfilling those incentives instead of doing things that were actually for the good of the organization. And wow, we could talk about that for hours and hours and hours. But they're rarely dumb.
Yeah.
Right? Because there was some process to get to the top of that hill.
Mm-hmm.
And it usually doesn't select for stupid. It usually doesn't select for genius, but it doesn't select for stupid. Right? And so quite often things that look stupid to us are when you actually look at, when you understand the incentives, what's really going on is they are incentivized to make bad decisions.
Yeah.
And if we fix that, we would get better decisions.
Most definitely. And you write about this in the book with the new book?
I do. And so what I say is, right there, when you think about it from my model, there are basically 4 outcomes for a president, right? You can get someone who is filtered and successful. So an organization product, think George H.W. Bush, right? That guy had been around the upper reaches of the American government for forever before he became president. Everyone knew exactly what they were getting. And he becomes president, and he was exactly what people predicted, right? He doesn't have the vision thing, as he himself said. He doesn't have some great economic reform. But if you want someone to figure out how to make sure that things go well in the middle, we're going to win a war in the Middle East and nothing does that. This is the guy. No one has when you read his books about his book about called A World Transformed, about his foreign policy, essentially, it's a masterclass.
Really?
So everyone should read it. This is how it's done, right? Because no one's ever been better trained to do it, and no one's ever been better at it. So filtered success, right? And then what about the second category would be filtered failure, right? So you get somebody who's just as experienced as George H.W. Bush, but everything goes wrong. That's exactly the category we're talking about, where something else, and so we can talk about what would do that. The other two.
Are you talking about the Dick Cheney presidency? Who's this George W. Bush guy? No, I'm just kidding.
So George H.W. Bush, right? The father, not the son. Yeah. A filtered success is exactly what we were just talking about, where the system is broken. right? So my example of that is my best example of that is James Buchanan. So Buchanan is the president for before the Civil War, from 1857 to 1861. He's basically the president who takes us into the Civil War, right? And so what happens there is Buchanan is from Pennsylvania, but his entire political persona was about giving the South, particularly the slave-holding interest in the South, everything they wanted. Whatever they wanted, he would give it to them. And he was the phrase for people like him was they were called dough faces. They were Northern men with Southern principles, right?
Wow.
So that was Buchanan, and he was the perfect dough face. And he's one of the three up until Joe Biden was elected. He is tied for the most experienced person ever to become president.
Wow.
And he's a total disaster. I mean, it's hard to do worse than the Civil War as your outcome, right? But what happened was the system has broken in such a way that the Southern slaveholding interests had captured the nominating process for the Democratic Party.
Wow.
So you could not be nominated by the party without the Southern interests signing off on your nomination. And they would not sign off on anyone who did not give them every single thing that they wanted.
Did Nixon copy this blueprint for this great Southern strategy?
Well, yeah, not nearly as bad, but yeah, I mean there are some pretty obvious parallels when you can think as we go later with the Southern strategy, and so
plus the assassination of both presidents that canceled that.
Yeah.
Wait, not really, but kinda. I mean, when you think about, anyway, sorry, I'm segueing, sidelining.
So yeah, so this is a system. So what I say is the hardest call for me is when you look at it, is you have to diagnose that a system, right? There's a system that's not giving you exactly what you want, and the system that has completely failed. Those are very different things. So the United States in 1857 completely failed, right? Like the system is a disaster and it's going to fracture, and that's what happened with Buchanan. A system that just doesn't give you exactly what you want, that you want to work with, because when the system, when you discard the system, it's a disaster, right?
Sorry to interrupt you. Was that why the South so spoiled from James Buchanan? That's why they rebelled against the election of Abraham Lincoln?
Not just James Buchanan, but before him was Franklin Pierce, who was no better. And so what happened was we sort of forget this, right? It's this weird American historical blank in our memory that we remember the founding generation with the Constitution, who sort of thought of slavery as this awful thing they were stuck with. And you can say, I don't have a lot of sympathy for you are rich and powerful off the back of the labor of people you're enslaving, but at least you acknowledge that it's a bad thing, right? Like that's not a lot, but that's something, right? By the 1850s, the position in the South was the overwhelmingly dominant position, what was called the pro-slavery movement, where they said slavery was a good thing. Right? That slavery, that's not just that we have nothing to be ashamed of. They would tell Northerners, you should be ashamed that you don't have slaves. You would even see Southern writers writing that actually Northern poor whites should be enslaved. They would be better off that way.
Wow.
Right. Yeah. And so what we forget by the 1850s is this was not a war between people who were hated slavery and wanted to abolish it, and people who hated slavery and were stuck with it. It's between people who didn't like the abolitionists hated slavery, and the Southern radicals who started the Civil War loved slavery, obviously only for other people.
Yeah.
Right. That's a very key component, is only for other people. And so was essentially what happened was you had the South in this spiral of constantly more radical demands, until it finally escalated to the point where, right, when they left when the states seceded in 1860, right, they didn't secede because the North was abolishing slavery. They seceded because a candidate got elected who they did not support.
Wow.
Right. That's it. Right. Like Lincoln didn't come out and say, I'm going to abolish it. He just said at most his policy position was, we're not going to let you expand slavery. Right. And even that, it's not clear, because we saw with Dred Scott that the Supreme Court, again, answering to Southern interests, gave them exactly what they wanted, which was the limitations on the power of the federal government to do that.
Wow. And so you were writing the book that he was a bad choice and ends up leading us down the pathway that sets up the Civil War. Do you see any similarities in today's world and what we're dealing with? Because a lot of people are talking about, the Civil War, the politicians inducing violence. If you've studied the history of the rise of fascism, authoritarianism in any democracy, you see that we're on a train rolling down the tracks to a possible bad ending. What do you see any similarities between that and what's going on today?
So I'm a political scientist by training. My
Mhm.
PhD was in political science. And I don't think you can find a political scientist who isn't incredibly worried
Mhm.
about what's happening right
Mhm.
now. Where essentially, I would say this is not a partisan statement. I just think it's true. Essentially, the large fractions of the leadership of one party essentially seem to believe that there is no such thing as a legitimate election that they lose.
Mhm.
Right? And you even see the leading candidates for Secretary of State in Arizona right now saying, right, essentially, there is no scenario where I will certify an election where where the Democrats win,
Mhm.
right? And like, you cannot have a stable democracy that depends on one of the parties winning every election, because eventually they will not.
Yeah.
And so this is really, I mean, this is something that when I talk to people, in the financial world, my friends and there are things like that, people who don't have this, background in political science, they're like, well, the American public's pretty, like they'll figure this out. And I'm sort of, the American public is very smart. This is not a question about how smart the public is. It's a question of whether the system can survive when there are very powerful actors who are trying to break it.
Yep.
And that, yeah, it's very worrying and it's very scary.
Yeah.
And the parallel to James Buchanan is, I say in the book, is you got to think about what is the interest group in the United States today that is so powerful it essentially can capture big chunks of the political process and say, if you do not go along with us, you cannot get elected. So since politicians are by definition ambitious people who want to get elected, they tend to go along. So in in the Republican Party today, it's almost impossible to get elected unless you're part of the Donald Trump's movement, right? Like there are examples of people who've been able to break, but they're not many.
Yeah.
Right. The governor of Georgia has done it. Brian Kemp has done it. There are a few others, and even not that much, right? Like he broke a little bit, but it's not like he's gone all the other direction.
Mhm.
But that's a political movement that is tied to an individual person who is not young. So if you sort of play out the clock long enough, things will change in that department. Maybe they won't get worse. Maybe he'll be replaced by someone who is worse. Like, you can imagine that scenario, but I can't forecast that.
Mhm.
If you were to look at the interest group, what I would say is really it's and I say this in the book, it's what you might call big finance, right? So the huge financial institutions that essentially blew up the world economy in 2007, like that is they are simply, to an extent that it is essentially impossible to exaggerate, the most powerful single interest group in the United States. Right. And it's, they're actually referred to as the blob in DC, right? Because they're there and they pay, so just to give you an example, and, I mean, look, like I work at a venture capital fund, right? Like there are big chunks of the financial sector that are very useful and very valuable. And, you would not want an American economy without venture capital. You just
Mhm.
wouldn't, right? Like that would be a disaster. I'm not saying everything VC does is great, but you want that, right? You
Mhm.
want an American economy with commercial lending. Like, that's really important. You want that. But if you work in finance and have the same level of education, right, that
Mhm.
someone who doesn't work in finance does, you're going to get paid about 50% more, right? There's no reason for that. It is simply a product of the political power of the industry.
Mhm.
If you are a senior executive in finance, you're going to get paid about 150% more. And if you are a senior executive in finance who works in New York or Connecticut or New Jersey, which basically means like the big hedge funds, the big banks, things like that, right? You're going to get paid 250% more.
Wow.
And that premium, by the way, is responsible for a big chunk of the increase in American inequality since 1980.
Yeah. Yeah.
But in 1980, before we deregulated the financial sector, do you know what the premium was to work in finance?
What?
0.
Really?
You didn't make anything more. Yeah. So what happened is the United States economy the financial sector has grown more and more and more. It's a process called financialization. It happens to economies. We can see an example of financialization in 12th century Venice, right? So this is a process that happens over and over again, where the financial sector gets bigger and bigger and more powerful, and essentially it strangles the rest of the economy.
Wow.
And that happens over and over again. And there is only one example of an economy that successfully reforms itself and brings that sector back down to size and creates a healthy, balanced economy that delivers for all its people. There's just one example, right? And by the way, the bigger the financial sector is, the more it's associated with inequality, with crashes, and with panics, like lots of bad things, right? With slower economic growth. All of those things all come from this very big. But so only one example seems like a really bad data. So here's the good side. The one example is us. The United States, not now, sadly. The United States did
for now.
Yeah, in the 1930s.
Okay.
With the post-Great Depression reforms, Franklin Roosevelt did that. And so when the Great Depression happened, the income premium for being in finance was exactly what it was in 2007. And then we did all these reforms and it went to zero. And so in fact, Peter Drucker, probably the greatest management thinker who's ever lived, right? He wrote in an article once, he said that, that the best students at Harvard Business School, he says, would feel ashamed to go to work at a bank. Says they want to go work for General Electric or for Boeing or for companies that build things that matter and that create value. And so he said that, and he was like, that's the way the economy works. That was the 1950s. We don't have that anymore because this one sector has become so powerful and so dominant in the economy that now, if you're a top graduate at Harvard Business School, where I taught for 7 years, you don't want to, like in general, you might go to a tech company that's becoming more and more prominent, but you're still, a lot of them are going to go to a big bank, and they're going to get paid a lot, and they're going to be very, but that has consequences that are really negative. And when you have that kind of money, you also have a lot of power, and we see that in the way we nominate candidates today.
Wow. I Googled this as you mentioned it, the financialization and Venice, because I want to read up some more on this, and it's pretty interesting. Did what happened? You talk about what happened in Venice. Is that what's leading them into the rebirth of Mussolinism?
I mean, we're talking about hundreds of years earlier, right?
Yeah.
So we're talking about Venice before Christopher Columbus even found America.
Okay.
Right, 12th century. But so I have an article I wrote called it was in Harvard Business Review called "The Price of Wall Street's Power" that talks about this in the United States and what we can do about it. And in fact, that was what kind of led me. That was one of the things that led me to understand how it is you can get like the biggest puzzle for me when I wrote this book is how can a filtered president fail? Because they're so carefully chosen, right? Like they should be able to do the job.
Yeah.
And the answer is they are chosen to fail because they are chosen to reflect the interests of that one powerful group. Slavery in the 1850s is the example, instead of the interests of the country as a whole.
Wow. So because they're picked to do that vision, they will fail because they don't represent the whole country and the interests of the whole country, and they don't execute in the interest of that country. Is that correct then?
I mean, what they'll say is, at the time they may think they're succeeding, but we will look back and say this was a disaster, right? Like political debates of the era kind of over time they come out in the wash. In 1863, was Abraham Lincoln recognized as the greatest of all American presidents? Probably not. But in 1963, nobody had any doubts.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you think the same thing will be said of Biden? I mean, he came in and kind of restored democracy and rule of law, and we're still seeing how the second act goes. Yeah. I mean, we don't know if we're going to end up like who's the head of Italy that had 2 horrible terms and almost drove them into the ground.
Berlusconi. Yeah.
I remember seeing the night Trump had won, 2 Italian reporters, journalists who'd outed Berlusconi and written about a lot of his problems and corruption. They're like, you just elected Berlusconi, him, and you may have second term, two terms where he did the same thing. He was run out of office, and then no one set rules or laws or anything, and he came back in and was worse. So we may be setting ourselves up for that. But I don't know. Maybe people will look back on Biden and say he was a great leveler. The thing that got me through the Trump years was one of the logs, I call it, that got me through the whitewater. There was President Obama saying, this country is, constantly in search of a perfect union, and we zig and we zag back and forth. I think was his quote. We zig and zag back and forth, and sometimes we zig one way and we zag back the other way. I don't know. What do you think about that, dude? Is that zig and zagging? Is that a referral to what you mentioned before, where sometimes one interest group takes over and takes us one way, and the rest of us go, no, this isn't America. I don't know.
So let me sort of ground it first. Is that like my parents are immigrants. Like a lot of people who are the children of immigrants, I am sort of fiercely patriotic about the United States, right?
Mhm.
Like this is the greatest country in the world, and I am not open to argument on that subject, right? Like, and I'm one of the lucky ones. Like it's treated me very well, but I've never had a doubt about that for a moment, and I never will, right? I will die believing that. I don't have any doubts about that. But it isn't that. But what I would say is the mistake we make is believing that is granted to us by divine right, not earned.
Mhm.
Right? The United States is lucky, and that unlike almost any other country in the world, its destiny is in its own hands. Right? Ukraine was invaded by Russia, and the only way this is not in any way a criticism of the unbelievable heroism and skill with which the Ukrainians defended their country. Right?
Yeah.
Like I think we are all in awe of what they've
Mhm.
done. But their destiny was not in their own hands. If the United States had not rallied to their side, if Western Europe had not rallied to their side, they would not have been able. There's no amount of skill that would have been able to save them, right?
Yeah.
But we are not faced with that. Our destiny is in our own hands, which means that we get to choose whether we go whenever we zig in the wrong direction. There's nothing ordaining that we go back in the right one. We have to do it. And no one can help us. And so that when I look at that, when I look at us where we are today, so as I said, you can't be knowledgeable about the subject and not terrified. I'm really worried. I'm very, very worried about what the next few years will look like. But if you also think about so President Biden was elected on not that close an election in 2020. But he took, with a slim margin in the House and a 0 vote margin in the Senate. And it is easy to criticize, what hasn't been done. The United States, and there are a lot of things we could say. The United States is about to drop out of the top 50 in life expectancy.
Wow.
In 1980, when Ronald Reagan was elected, we were first.
Mm-hmm.
We're about to drop out of the top 50, right? Like, what an unimaginable catastrophe. Inequality is, like there are a lot of different ways which we could talk about, and obviously it's much worse in the United States for minorities and for there are many ways in which even as the United States delivers for some segments of its population, it's even failing even more badly with others.
Mm-hmm.
But for all of that, my wife is from Sweden, right? And so we went to Sweden and visited for my first time this summer. And it's an amazing kind of so it's people, they live a long time. Everybody's tall. I felt like a hobbit, right? Great. But and I'm not short. But if Sweden were an American state and we put it in per capita, do you know what state it would be closest to?
What?
You want to guess?
Now, are we talking about a country state, or are we talking about a state in this?
Yeah, like if it was California or Texas or whatever, like per capita income, right? Which is a pretty good measure of wealth. What state would Sweden be most comparable
to? Probably New York.
Yeah, you would think that. It's Missouri.
What the fuck?
Yeah. So Sweden is a wealthy country.
I was going to say Alabama just as a joke,
yeah.
But
so Sweden is a wealthy country, and Missouri, is a wonderful state. Like, I've been there many times. My college roommate was from Missouri. I love it dearly. But Missouri is not one of the wealthiest states in the country. It's not close to being one of the wealthiest states in the country.
So basically, Sweden's like Deliverance or something? What's going on?
No, well, Sweden is much more equal than any, right? So the wealth that they have is distributed amongst the population much more evenly than it is any American state. But we forget the United States is unimaginably wealthy, right? It is spectacularly rich.
Mm-hmm.
And
I think in Missouri it's mostly. Wait, hold on. That's a Mississippi joke. I was going to say it's Brett Favre, but never mind. That's another joke.
Yeah, right. I mean, so when we think about like how is it done? Well, 220 some years ago, the United States was 13 colonies hanging on the edge of the Atlantic. And now it is the wealthiest, most powerful country in human history. Right? It is so much wealthier than wealthy countries that wealthy countries like Sweden would be poor states in the United States. Right? That's what the only countries that are richer than the United States are oil states. Right? Like they're various countries that are floating on lakes of oil. That's kind of the only way you get to be in our league.
Yeah, Russia's a gas station, really.
Well, Russia's not even close to our league, but like Norway, right? So Norway has a higher per capita income than we do. They have a lot of oil. So when I say it's like what's going on with the system, right? It's like with Biden it's worth saying, okay, but the system has worked a lot better maybe than we give it credit for. And even when it hasn't worked for for many Americans, right? Certainly it didn't work at all for African Americans for a very long stretch of time. Even there, it started to improve. Much too long. It took much too long. It's been much too slow. But it has at least started to improve. And there's at least recognition by many Americans that this was a huge failure for which we need to correct. We
weren't really a democracy until the 60s.
Yeah, that's right. The United States was not in any meaningful sense a democracy until the 1960s. And we forget that. But so look at Joe Biden, right? He's elected with I think a 4-seat margin in the House and a 0-seat margin in the Senate, right? This isn't narrow. This is non-existent. This is the thinnest thing in history. This is just insanely thin, right? And with an opposition that is just pretty draconian on not really willing to compromise. With that thin a margin, this administration has passed, right, the first gun control in 20 some years, the largest piece of industrial policy in the CHIPS Act in American history, right, to bring production of sort of critical technologies back onshore into the United States. And in the climate change bill that we just passed, just to put in perspective, this is a larger bill passed in a single session of Congress, right? A larger commitment to dealing with climate change than every country in the European Union has done combined in their entire history.
Wow. Holy crap. That's
right. It's gargantuan, right? I mean, so none of this is meant to say that the United States shouldn't do better. Of course it should do better.
We should do better.
We should do better, right? And we have the resources to do better. We just said, right? Like we're incredibly rich. But we should also acknowledge that, hey, maybe the system's not working as badly as we thought, right? The 2008 financial crisis, global financial crisis, it happened here, but of all of the major industrial countries, we recovered fastest.
Yeah, that's true.
Right?
That's true.
So the system here, it might be a little bit more resilient than we give it credit for being. And I look at Biden and I say, well, is he going to be remembered up there with, on Mount Rushmore? I don't know. It's too soon to tell. It's 1.5 years. And a lot of it's going to depend on what happens next, right? If he wins in 2024, and then in 2028, right, you get to the point where we're not worried about the stability of democracy because we've passed right now the Electoral Count Act that's being considered in the House and Senate. But if that's passed, it's going to do a lot to stabilize the system, right? If we look at that and we're saying, maybe he didn't get us all the policies, victories we would have liked, maybe there's some change, whatever. I don't know. In some level, I don't care. If 8 years, if 5, 6 years from now, we look back and we say, if the Republicans win, we're like, the system will not fall apart. And if the Democrats win, the system will not fall apart. That will be a pretty heroic achievement. I think historians will look back and give him a lot of credit for that.
It is kind of interesting how I've noticed that some of the Trump pick candidates, after they won their primaries, have fallen back to becoming not election deniers. There's still some that are doing it, but it's kind of interesting how they flip-flop back to the thing, and hopefully people recognize the importance of our democracy and get out and vote. This referendum that we'll have on 2022 will be pretty interesting. From what you've outlined in your book and talked about, do you see do you see any of that coming into play in 2022 with the elections that are going on? I mean, it's kind of weird where we're at. I had said to my friends when the SCOTUS thing had leaked that they possibly might be overturning Roe versus Wade. At that point, we had incredible apathy with Democrats. I'm a moderate Democrat, full disclosure. We had incredible apathy that these guys were going to show up, and I just really do not want to hear in the next 2 years 50,000 committees on Hunter Biden's laptop. I just really don't care, and I don't know what that has to do with my democracy. But and in the romper room that we had before, the House is always a romper room, really, when you study history, I guess. But the Senate's like, the grown-ups, I guess. But Nancy Pelosi's done a great job. I have to say, I think so. But there's certain area of the House that seems to be a romper room. If you watch the news on any given day. But segues aside, we have the, and I said, if SCOTUS overturns Roe versus Wade, this nation may actually need that to save it, because it will get out the vote. I mean, it's not cool what's happening on the side of that, but we may need that to save this nation. And I think I might be right from what we're seeing, and now everyone gives a shit about turning out in 2022 and stuff.
I mean, it's really clear that Dobbs transformed the 2022 election, right? There's just no doubt about it.
Mhm.
And we don't know what it's going to do in 2024, but my guess is the implications of it will not have faded.
Yeah.
Not fully have faded by that. They might have faded some.
I think you'll be right, because SCOTUS, I mean, even if we take the Senate, the Democrats take the Senate, it's going to take years to restack the SCOTUS.
Yeah, unless they decide to expand the Supreme Court, it will take generations. And there's no question that on areas like environmental regulation, it's going to be much harder than it was with this court. Things like a variety of issues. In terms of abortion rights, if Democrats have control of the House and Senate, they can pass federal laws to protect that. And then we'll see if the court is willing to overturn those laws. That would be pushing to a whole new level that they might be a little worried to do, especially if they see a massive backlash against them in the public. Right?
They kind of saw that with Kansas, where
that's right. Yeah,
they all went, "Holy shit, women are really pissed off at us."
I mean, I was relatively optimistic about the outcome in Kansas and way underestimated what actually came out. Right?
Wow.
So it was suddenly but this is my sort of going back. Maybe it's that patriotism thing again. I have faith in the average American, right? Like I actually don't have much. I do not doubt that most Americans want to do the right thing and care about their country and want. The question is not do Americans, are they going to do the right thing here? The question is the system going to allow them to?
Yeah.
Right. And the system is old.
Yeah.
Right. The U.S. government is not older than the French and the Italian and the German governments. Right. It's older than all of them combined. Like the system as it exists now is very, very different from what it was imagined to being when the Constitution was written. And so what we are for 200 years, we have survived more than that now, 220 years. We have survived well because everybody kind of agreed that the survival of the system was more important than winning an election. Right? Like there was a basic agreement that we were not going to go to the wall.
Yeah. The one fundamental core of us was that we handed power from one person to another, even if we thought that maybe things weren't right. With
That's
Nixon,
right.
there was questions about John F. Kennedy and, stuff they'd done, polling things. I think there's been a lot of history written on that. Nixon could have been a dick. And, he later was. Nixon could have been a dick. Richard could have been a dick. There's a joke there. But he didn't, because he cared about the Constitution and that transfer of power. That's the one thing that's always separates. That one single thing seems to make all the difference. Gore versus Bush, the question of what happened there. The same thing with, Trump, where, there's you have the college, the electoral college versus the popular vote. Both Gore and Trump are two people that were elected against the popular vote.
Bush and Trump.
Bush and Trump.
Yep.
Did I say Gore and Trump?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yes. Yeah. Sure. So yeah, I stand corrected. So the the handover, like you're talking about, is really important. And of course, now we see that they've attacked, the great Steve Bannon strategy, attack the electoral process in and of itself. And we see that when that happens, you're seeing the attack go on, I think, in Brazil now, where, the question of the vote and, study of history and fascism. So it'll be really interesting to see what as we go out, we've got to touch on some other things in the book, make sure we get some plugs in. Anything more we need to talk about in the book or tease out, or you want to add on to what I just
so two things. One is, it's easy for us to forget how important the presidency is, right? Because we're the beneficiaries of a government that works, right? And if you want to see what a government that doesn't work looks like, take a look at Afghanistan, or like there are plenty of places where the government just doesn't work. Ours doesn't work as well as we would like it to, but that's a whole different world from it doesn't work at all. And the presidency plays a key role in that. Layered on top of that, of course, is the presidency has powers that no other human being. The president has powers that no other human being can approach.
Yeah.
Right. The president is one of two people on Earth who can end human civilization if they choose to do so.
Yeah.
Right. That's scary. That's scary stuff, right? That like the president of the United States has power that 200 years ago we would have attributed only to God, right?
Yeah.
They can control whether the crops grow, not control, but at least influence, and also kill people from a distance, right? Okay.
Yeah.
So the first is we need to take it seriously, right? You can't vote for someone. You need to really think about do you trust this person with power? The second is, I think what the book really brings out is how often many of the things that we love about the United States have survived or advanced because of luck, right? We just got lucky. We got lucky over and over again, right?
You have to get lucky a little bit.
You have to get lucky, right? I mean, but Theodore Roosevelt, the first great reformist president, right? The person who just in many ways created the modern presidency and much of modern life, and is one of the most charismatic and sort of interesting people who's ever lived, right? Like Theodore Roosevelt became president because the powers that be in the Republican Party made him vice president in order to get rid of him. They were like, this guy's a reformer. He's actually serious. He actually wants to regulate business and make the average person better off. We can't have that. Let's put him in a place where he cannot possibly do any harm. I know, the vice presidency, right?
Didn't they do that with Johnson too? I don't know.
And so they made him vice president to get rid of him.
Was that Kennedy's idea?
Yeah. And then McKinley is assassinated, and all of a sudden he's president of the United States, and he uses it, right? He does not slow down even for an instant. I don't think he was capable of slowing down. So what we see over and over again is the fact that the system worked in that sense, right? Doesn't mean you should rely on it.
That's true,
right? Luck is not a method.
Yeah.
And so what we also should do is think, is both. I think it's interesting, right? I love American history. It's kind of cool knowing all the different accidents that happened. The fact that Harry Truman, who was also an extraordinarily good president, right, only became president by the skin of his teeth.
Yeah,
but it came very, very close to going a very different way. Right. So American history, I find American history fascinating. But if you don't, I think you might find out it's even more interesting than you think, because there's a lot there going on and when you tell the story this way, it comes out. It's a much more of a high wire act than I think most of us realized when we were studying it in high school.
Yeah.
And then the last thing I say is it is possible to do a better job. I do suggest some reforms in the book that you don't have to amend the Constitution, right? We don't have to rebuild the system from scratch. Relatively small things we could do that really would hugely improve our odds of getting not just good but great presidents.
What do you think about the new Electoral Act thing? I'm not sure if it's been signed off on yet. I think it's still kind of
the Electoral Count Act.
Electoral Count Act.
Yeah,
there's supposed to be some of the stuff that's been reformed from the 1800s in there.
Yeah, it is an absolute necessity. Passing it is literally the most important thing in the United States right now.
Wow.
It will close many of the vulnerabilities that the Trump administration tried to exploit in 2020 to overturn the election. And if it does that, then I won't have zero worry, but I will be way less worried than I would be without its passage.
Yeah, I think the Senate's passing it. I know McConnell signed off on it.
I think it will pass.
That's usually a sign. We still have the House, so So yeah, that would be good. You know, I mean, I guess a lot of the original law was written in the 1800s, and some of it was pretty ambiguous.
It's in fact uninterpretable.
Yeah.
It was very badly drafted, and there are big chunks of it that it is impossible to make even to figure out what they were trying to say.
Yeah. You know, I'm glad you have a lot of faith in us Americans. As an American who lived here and spent his first half of his life in complete apathy and thinking that he was entitled, you know, the classic asshole American who thinks that, oh, in democracy is just like my milk. It's always been on the shelf, so it'll always be there tomorrow, whether I vote or not. We have a lot of that going on in the country. And we had a severe attack over the last, I don't know, 20, 30, 40 years of making us stupider as a people because we don't care. And also, you know, spending $8 trillion in wars as opposed to building better schools and paying teachers. And I don't think it's getting better. You know, George Carlin has a famous quote that I'm always reminded of almost on a daily basis, whether I'm on social media or talking to me about politics. And the quote is, think how stupid the average person is and realize half of them are stupider than that. And I don't know what circles you run in, but you've probably been on Twitter and social media, I'm sure.
I mean,
you have more faith in American people than I do. That's what I'm leading to. What do you think about
YouTube
that?
comment sections are where human thought goes to die.
But, I know we have a big channel.
but what let me flip that around.
Okay.
I don't think you have to be so.
Give me some hope, baby.
You quoted George Carlin. You know, let me quote. Let's flip quote. Now I'm blanking on the philosopher. What's wrong? Hobbes. It's Thomas Hobbes, right? Where he said, right, that the people are much more you know, the wisest councilman, that's his phrasing, right? So the wisest public official is less acute at understanding someone else's interests than that person is at understanding their own. And so what I'd say is democracy doesn't require us all to be geniuses, right? That's not, you know, that would not be a system that could ever work. It requires us to think about, you know, in its real sense, one is to vote retrospectively, to say, well, the last 4 years, am I happy or not? And if both parties are functioning, that works really well, right? So if both parties are functioning, you say, well, I'm not happy with the last 4 years, let's do a change, or I am happy with the last 4 years, let's stay the same. That can work. If both parties are working, that's great. That'll treat that was big chunks of American history. But I think what it requires us to do is not, you know, we don't all need to be deep scholars of international relations or the federal budget. But what we do need to do is to take our job as American citizens seriously
and show up to vote.
But also, you know, like, say that, okay, I may not understand, you know, climate change, but there are people who do. And I should accept that, you know, I don't, and I should listen to them, and I should take that into account, right? You know, experts get things wrong all the time. There's no doubt about that.
Especially pollsters.
But yeah, but you know, everybody gets things wrong all the time, right?
Ask any husband.
Yeah, right. I mean, yeah, I absolutely. Everybody gets things wrong all the time. So, you know, if you say, well, the experts are wrong, have been wrong before, I'm true. What's your alternative, right? So, I do think take your responsibilities as an American citizen seriously. Vote, and vote in a way that is, you know, this is a thing you do that helps to determine the fate of the world.
And of
vote
course,
like it does.
Yeah. And of course, read your book as well. So you know how to vote correctly by picking leaders that aren't going to fail. So there you go. Can I offer you just a comedic debate? Thomas Hobbes was born in was in the 1700s. George Carlin died in 2007. So I'm thinking, you know, maybe Thomas Hobbes didn't have Instagram. I don't know.
Well,
Instagram wasn't around in 2007.
One can only imagine what he would have done with it.
Yeah,
but you know what?
He hasn't seen us lately, is my point.
I bet you Alexander Hamilton would have been the greatest tweeter of all time.
Would he been? Do you think would he have been an angry, toxic tweeter? Or
he would have been everything, right? It depends on his mood at any given day, but yeah.
Was that his crystal flute?
That was James Madison's, wasn't it?
James Madison's.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
I would have liked to seen his tweets too. So this has been very interesting and very insightful. People should pick up your book so they understand why the importance of their vote. And I'm glad you have faith. You know, I love people who come here as immigrants. My great grandfather's an immigrant for Germany, so definitely I'm 2-generational immigrant. Everybody's an immigrant in this country when it really comes down to it at the core. But yeah, there's a real apathy towards people that grew up here. That democracy's always been there, and so they always think it'll be there. And hopefully we learn from January 6th. I think right now we're talking with the authors of one of the officers of January 6th who was almost killed and dragged into the group, Mike Fanone.
Oh, Mike Fanone. Oh,
Yeah.
I read a profile of him. That's going to be fun.
Yeah. We're talking. I've talked with his co-author, and we're talking about having them on. So hopefully we'll have them scheduled soon. But January 6th is, we almost kind of needed January 6th, so that low point, that dark point, to go, what the hell. But then also it's reminiscent, right? I had Tom Hartman, the radio host, on a week later after January 6th just for a book that was scheduled. And I remember at the end of the show, he threw me off my chair when he said, January 6th, they call January 6th, right? And I go, what? It goes a rehearsal.
Yeah.
And he referenced Hitler's beer hall. And I think there's some other, I can't remember if it was a Pinochet or was some sort of other fascist uprising, Mussolini warm up. So, I don't know. It's going to be a really interesting ride the next 2 to 4 years.
It will be. But I mean, if there's one note I would say about contemporary politics, it's we get to decide we get to decide where the ride ends
for now,
and nobody else does. Right? It is up to us. We get to make that choice.
Yeah. We get an election or two more. And after that, it's anybody's bet. But people should read your book so they understand this more. People should see the insight of why it's important to pick a president that's good for America. I tell people now, I've one of the arguments I used to have with people when I still had Republican friends was, if Donald Trump had been a Democrat, you would have voted for him because you vote straight ticket Democrat. No, I don't. And I think more and more people need to realize this. And I think I kind of saw that with the Biden election, because there were a lot of people, because Ruth Bader Ginsburg had died, that were worried about the abortion in the Senate and the SCOTUS. And I saw a lot of Republicans that voted for Biden. And so I'm hoping that, I tell people nowadays, you need to vote for the Constitution. I call myself a constitutionalist. I don't know if that's anyone's using that term, but to me, I've talked a lot about nowadays that this is a system where it's a relay race, where we're handing a baton from one president to another, and we're saying, take this little young American democracy, this republic, on for another 4 years, carry the mantle, do the things that you talk about in your book, and we've talked about on the show today, to make sure that we ensure that democracy works, and that hopefully they do the best that they can possibly do. May not be the best if we're armchairing it from quarterbacks, eating our popcorn when we're watching The Bachelor. It shows that, whatever. I'm going to get sued by The Bachelor, I guess now. But we're hopefully will take us to a better point that we were from the prior 4 years. Then we zig or zag, or at least hopefully we'll recognize that, hey, maybe those last 4 years could have been better, and we'll do better. But to me, I'm a constitutionalist. If Donald Trump had been a Democrat president, I would have voted Republican. And I left the Republican Party in 2012. I've moved around because I really have learned I care more about the Constitution. So I hope that whatever I'm rambling about will make sense to anyone listening. And then also trying to find the exit ramp here in the segue. But I hope that we'll get there. What do you think?
I hope that we'll get there too. And like I said, I have faith, but I am very, very worried. Right, the next few years are things could go really bad, really fast in this country in ways that very few of us appreciate. But I have a lot of Republican friends, right? Because I spent a lot of time working with the military.
You're in venture capital.
Oh, yes, that's true. Yeah, also true. But I spent a lot of time working with the military, and so in fact, I just got off the phone with the general of the Air Force. Literally, I had to hang up to take this call to do this podcast with you, right? And he's a Republican, so they take an oath to the Constitution. So I worked for the federal government as a summer intern of all things, in high school and in college. And the funny thing is, when you do that, you take an oath. You take the same oath. You take a loyalty oath to the Constitution too. Yeah,
as an intern
it's
too.
not that different. Preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic.
Mhm.
And the thing about the oath when you take it is there's no time limit. It doesn't say, the oath doesn't go, as long as I'm an employee of the federal government.
Yeah.
Now, when you take that thing, it's for life. Right?
Really?
You take it, you
Wow.
take it, and it is until you. I mean, if you listen to the words and you take it seriously, and I did, it's for life.
Wow.
You take it until the day you die.
Wow.
And so, yeah, look, my friends who I said I have lots of friends who are Republicans, and we can have different differences on tax rates, and war on foreign policy, and you name it, any issue you want. But the area where we have to be in agreement is to support, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic.
Mhm.
And that really is the line that every American has to draw, right? We
Yeah,
all got to remember that.
Yeah. And the right to vote, the freedom to vote. I mean,
Which is the foundation of every other
Yeah.
freedom and every other liberty. That's
I mean, we have to recognize that we have to recognize, in my opinion, we have to recognize that transfer of power is the one thing that makes it different, because a lot of countries vote. Russia votes. We just saw, the voting they did in Crimea and Ukraine at gunpoint. They went door to door with guns and went, "Hey, you're voting today." Maybe we should do that in this country, but not with guns. Because that would end badly if they did that in Texas. I think that's a joke. But it's that whole transfer of power, that going, okay, I won, or I lost. Okay, let's pass that to the next thing, and we're going to resolve that next time, like Nixon did with John F. Kennedy. It was a bitter pill that he had to swallow. I'm sure Al Gore probably, I don't know, has nightmares every day about it, or every night about it. Maybe he sleeps during the day. I do at my age, so he probably does too. So maybe he does have those nightmares in the day. Anyway, jokes aside, people should read your book, is what I'm trying to roundabout
you,
get
Chris.
back to figure out the best way to pick their presidents and the best way to do it. And for my money, I love the Constitution. I love democracy. I want everyone to have the right to vote. I think that's important to protect. We should look at what SCOTUS is doing, with everything from Citizens United to all the other things that they've done. I think there's some voting things they have coming up on their agenda, if I recall rightly. But everyone should have the right to vote in this country. There should be polling places everywhere. There should be encouragement to get a vote, so it represents what this whole country wants. And I'm going to hold on to your faith and your belief in this country that we're good people and we're going to do the right thing. I'm going to hold on to that as long as I can. And if not, I may end up crying about it at night. 4 years later, I'll put on a pillow and stuff. But you believe in these people in this country more than I do, so I'm going to hold on to your faith as opposed to my own.
Well, thank you, Chris.
There you go. Give me your .com so people can order up the book and find out how to make a better country.
Gautam Mukunda, GAUTAM MUKUNDA.com, on Twitter at GMukunda, at GMUKUNDA. Picking Presidents is on Amazon, your local bookstore, you name it, you'll find it.
Yeah. And all my jokes aside, there's a lot of jokes I put in the show. You've given me a little bit more faith in this country and hopefully what I'll do. And I needed that shot in the arm. I talked to some idiots the other day that they had the most extraordinary conversation. We actually argued what you and I talked about earlier, whether or not the president is the most powerful people in the world. And I'm like, he has a nuclear football. And they're like, yeah, but it has to take 20. They literally told me that it had to take 24 hours for the president, when he activates the nuclear football, for the Joint Chiefs of Staff or something to approve it. And I was like, this is the people who are voting. You people are voting. And George Carlin, of course, came to mind at that time. And I explained to them, I says, no, it's an immediate, it's like, I think it takes 20 minutes for those nuclear bombs to land once they're in the air, and that button is pressed. I mean, it goes to a guy. I watched the sequence on TV. At least, I don't know. I trust everything that's on TV except for The Bachelor and Survivor. Anyway, pick up the book, folks, wherever fine books are sold. Picking Presidents, How to Make the Most Consequential Decision in the World. I highly recommend it because you definitely want to understand what's the old line I always say on the show? It's my quote. The one thing man can learn from his history is that man never learns from his history. and thereby is this folly. So it's been wonderful to have you on the show. Thank you for coming on, and brilliant discussion. It's been very insightful in spite of all the comedy I've kind of thrown in there to make it fun.
Thank you, Chris. It was a pleasure.
There you go. And hopefully we'll be talking about your future books in a democracy to come.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much for tuning in. Go to goodreads.com/Chris Voss. I'm sure his book will be up there. Go to all of our groups on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, all those crazy places the kids are playing nowadays. Stay safe. Register to vote. Damn it. I think I'm going to start ending the show with reminding people to register to vote. Register to vote. Be good to each other. Stay safe. We'll see you next time.
Take care.